This show's going to be just a little bit different than your average run-of-the-mill compendium narrative show. In this one, we're mining the narrative out of a single book, well, a couple books, maybe not a single one. I couldn't help myself. I had to grab more than just the one. But we're looking at a very specific thing here. We're looking at how Alexander the Great managed to beat the Persians, not through tactics or strategy, but through logistics. How on earth did he manage to get an army all the way out into Persia and then down into India and then across the Gadrobi Desert? How did he manage to do all of these logistical feats of near magic for the time? How did he keep the Macedonian army happy? We're going to try to answer those questions and a few other ones that maybe you didn't even think to ask here on this special edition of Compendium. A quick reminder before we get going as well, if you want to support me and what I'm doing here with Compendium, or if you've come across my videos on TikTok or Instagram and you want to support what I'm up to, you can support me on Substack. All of that and more is linked down there in the description below. And final announcement, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that rating and reviewing helps the show quite a bit. It helps with the algorithm, whatever the podcast algorithms are. Rating and reviewing helps somehow, so rate and review the show before you click off. All right, without any further ado, let's talk about some logistics. Let's talk about how Alexander the Great managed to defeat the Persians with supply, with the overland campaign. How did he feed an army? Well, we're going to explore that here in Blueprint for Empire.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
They say amateurs study strategy and the professionals study logistics. At least that's what I've been told anyway. And while I would never claim to be any sort of a professional, I thought that we might study some logistics. This is going to be a little bit different. It is not a narrative episode, nor is it really an analytical episode, but this is somewhat of a blending of the different things that you would know me for. I think this entire compendium process, I've been trying to blend these two worlds together, this reading history world, blend them in a way that is, natural and conceivable and makes sense for everyone. That doesn't get rid of the things that I started this podcast in order to do, doesn't get rid of the heart of it, the heart being examine figures in history and make the 2D versions that you would have learned in school, make those 2D versions three-dimensional. It doesn't abandon that goal or ethos at all. And yet also still allows you to, examine figures in history in a narrative sense. It also, we don't abandon some of the bedrock elements of what makes Compendium. How can we marry that up with where you probably heard of me from with TikTok, Instagram, reviewing books, talking about history books, fantasy books, etc. How do we blend those two things together? And I've been stewing on this idea over the past couple weeks, and we're going to try it out. See if it works. If it doesn't work, let me know. But we're going to trial run this idea. And I wanted to pick a book to sort of examine, see what we can pull from, see what narrative we can mine from this single book, while also examining, some of these aspects that you would find in a typical compendium show. I was trying to find the perfect book to start this off with, and I keep coming back to a book that I've talked about on social media a couple times. If you follow me there, you will not be unfamiliar with this book completely, but it's a book by Donald Engels. Scholars of ancient history will be familiar with this book, but the average Joe has no idea what this book is, and probably you read the title and you go, ugh, I don't know, that one's not for me. It's Alexander the Great and the Logistics of the Macedonian Army. It is a book about how Alexander supplied his army through his expedition through Persia and beyond Persia, how he supplied his army in some really interesting scenarios in Iran, in India. How does he conquer Persia? Well, the amateur will tell you that it was strategic things that he did on the battlefield, maybe at Gaugamela or at the Issus. But the expert historian will say, no, it wasn't because Alexander won those battles. Yes, those were important and consequential, but it wasn't because of those things exclusively. It was because Alexander the Great understood logistics, because his army was better prepared, better provisioned, oftentimes better rested when it came to fight a battle. So that when Darius of Persia came up against Alexander, he was in many ways inferior, probably because his logistics planning was inferior, his army was less prepared, less ready to engage Alexander in the field. Examining this book also gives me an excuse to talk about Alexander the Great, which it's somebody that I've wanted to do a narrative series on, but if you pay attention to history podcasts at all, the king of history podcasts is currently working on an Alexander the Great series. And let's be honest, I probably couldn't do it better than him. So what's the point in trying to do it while he is doing it? If I were to examine Alexander the Great, it would need some time. Some stuff would have to settle for a few years before I came back to it. We'd have to have some additional sources, all these things. So there's no point in me doing that. But what we can do is we can look at what Donald Engels gives us here in Alexander the Great, and the logistics of the Macedonian army gives us a chance to talk about Alexander a little bit, but maybe through this prism. Another thing to note, and I'm sure a couple of you have already noted this, my pronunciation of Macedon, Macedonia, or Macedonian, it's probably going to sound a little off to you. And I get this comment quite a lot, have gotten it in the past, to the point that one of my pinned videos on social media in the past was me explaining my heretical pronunciation of Macedonia. There's a reason why I do it. I don't do it just because it sounds nice or is cool or is different for the sake of being different. I have a reason behind it, and I figured it's worth explaining to you so at least you can understand where I'm coming from. Maybe you don't fall into this same boat. Maybe you're not going to pronounce Macedonia with that hard sound. Maybe you're going to pronounce it with a more traditional modern English pronunciation, which is that soft C, Macedonia. The reason I pronounce it with the hard Macedonia sound is because that's how Alexander the Great would have pronounced it. And this is the sort of pronunciation thing that you have to kind of pick and choose your battles. I'm going to recognize that not everything that would traditionally get that hard, K sound gets the K sound. For example, with names like Caesar or Kaiser, if you were to pronounce that the way that the Romans would have said it at the time, they'd be saying Kaiser or Kaiser or something like that. Caesar is a modern English pronunciation for, the Julius Caesar would be Julius Kaiser or something along those lines. But of course, if I start talking about Kaisers, you're going to think of the Germans in like the 1890s. Because in German, that pronunciation would be Kaiser. So when you're talking about Kaiser Wilhelm or something like that, they would be calling him Caesar. You see how this can get a little hairy. So you got to pick and choose your battles. Obviously, I'm not going to say Julius Kaiser because then it can get a little confusing. It's not abundantly clear who I'm talking about. The same way the great, famous Roman orator Cicero would be pronounced Cicero in this same sort of pronunciation. The meaning can get a bit obscured when you decide, hey, I'm going to pronounce the way they would have pronounced it for all the names. When you take a stand on that hill, it can get a little confusing sometimes. But with something like this, Scythian, Macedon, these names would, be pronounced with that hard K sound in the ancient Greek or the ancient Latin. But their meaning is not obscured when I then revert to that ancient pronunciation. So there are some names and some places that You can kind of pick and choose and say, okay, if I'm not going to obscure the meaning, let's revert to that ancient pronunciation. But if the meaning gets obscured, if things get a little difficult to understand, it becomes not worth it anymore. And I understand this is extremely semantic. And I also understand that this is probably part of my own nature. I'm a bit of a contrarian at heart. I latched onto this pronunciation because I heard some other folks do it, and I heard the reasoning why and did a little bit of my own research and said, actually, that sounds pretty good. Most people aren't going to pronounce it that way. And honestly, you do get some comments when you make a video or talk about some things, as I'm sure this will, where somebody hears you go, Macedonia, that doesn't sound right. I haven't said that ever. Of course, if you were to go to Macedonia today, they'd pronounce it in their own language with the hard K sound. It's one of those things where you pick and choose the hill you're willing to die on. And this, for me, is, I suppose, a hill I'm willing to die on. But that is not to say that when you hear me be a little hypocritical with the hard K pronunciation, that I'm doing it because I don't understand what I'm doing or I'm some kind of an idiot, although I might be some kind of an idiot. But at least in this specific instance where I have consciously thought about what I'm doing. And if that bugs you, I'm very sorry, but at least now we can operate under the same terms. We all know what we're talking about. Okay, a little background before we get started here. In 336 BC, or BCE, Philip II of Macedon is murdered at a grand sort of gathering that he holds, a wedding. It's an opportunity in his mind to kind of reunite all of Greece together, to sort of remind everybody that Philip II is in charge. And it's also sort of this moment when he gets to kind of bask in his glory and sort of see all the things that he's accomplished, his life's work. But it's also kind of this, some historians would argue this, like a staging moment for the next act in Philip II's life. The next act, it's known to everybody in the Macedonian court that he has aims on Persia. And Philip has been fighting for years on end. I mean, every campaign season, Philip's been going out and sort of playing whack-a-mole with different rebellions in and around Greece. He's reminding everybody, I'm the big bad top dog. You could almost think of him as like the crime don of a mafia family. You can't see me right now, but I'm holding this massive 1939 edition of The Life of Greece by Will Durant, the famous historian. He is a national treasure, Will Durant. We don't have historians quite like him still doing history. And I love this book for many reasons. It's sentimental. It's like a family heirloom almost. But even more than that, I just love how Will Durant writes history. He writes it like it's some sort of an epic, like a Homeric kind of history, which I think is probably part of what he's trying to do. But Will Durant writes one of the best descriptions of Philip, and also of Alexander, but one of the best descriptions of Philip that I've ever come across. He writes this about Philip, and I think you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody else who can describe Philip any better. He says, quote, "Like his famous son, he was a man of violent temper and abounding generosity, loving battle as much and strong drink more. Unlike Alexander, he was a jovial laugher, and raised to high office a slave who amused him. He liked boys, but liked women better, and married as many of them as he could. For a time he tried monogamy with Olympias, the wild and beautiful Molossian princess who gave him Alexander. But later his fancy traveled, and Olympias brooded over her revenge. Most of all, he liked stalwart men who could risk their lives all day and gamble in corrals with him half the night. He was literally, before Alexander, the bravest of the brave, and left a part of himself on every battlefield. What a man! Exclaimed his greatest enemy, Demosthenes. Now quoting Demosthenes. For the sake of power and dominion, he had an eye struck out, a shoulder broken, an arm and a leg paralyzed. He had a subtle intelligence, capable of patiently awaiting his chance, and of moving resolutely through difficult means to distant ends. In diplomacy, he was affable and treacherous. He broke a promise with a light heart and was always ready to make another. He recognized no morals for governments and looked upon lies and bribes as humane substitutes for slaughter. But he was lenient in victory and usually gave the defeated Greeks better terms than they gave one another. All who met him, except the obstinate Demosthenes, liked him and ranked him as the strongest and most interesting character of his time." End quote. Philip's greatest contribution to the Alexandrian legend and to, Greek history in general is his changes made to the phalanx, to the way that Greeks fought battles. And he only really changes a couple of things, but the changes that he makes are incredibly impactful. As a boy, he spent a great amount of time in Thebes, and the Thebans were the dominant Greek city-state when Philip was there. He observed how they fought. He observed their phalanx formation, and he said, okay, we're getting towards lighter armor. We're getting towards longer spears that aren't really spears anymore. They're now pikes. And we're integrating cavalry. And Philip says, okay, we can iterate on these things, and he makes some changes. These changes combined with a force that is a standing force now, it's a professional force that he then will take and use every campaign season to the point that they're a hardened military. They're a military that has seen some things, right? It's a veteran quarterback, a veteran boxer, somebody who has seen tactics, fought, tested things here and there, and has formed a strategy and, a tactical base or handbook that is undefeated in Greek warfare. Will Durant again writes about how Philip changes these things and how he iterates upon them to create the Maserati, this turnkey military that he will eventually hand to his son. Durant writes, quote, 800 feudal barons made up the king's companions. They were great landowners who despised the life of cities, crowds, and books. But when, with their consent, the king announced a war, they came out of their estates physically fit and drunkenly brave. In the army they served as cavalry, riding the sturdy horses of Macedonia and Thrace, and trained by Philip to fight in a close formation that could change its tactics at once and as one at the commander's word. Beside these was an infantry of rugged hunters and peasants, arrayed in phalanxes, or 16 rows of men pointing their lances over their heads, or resting them on the shoulders of the rows ahead of them, making each phalanx an iron wall. The lance, 21 feet long, was weighted at the rear, so when held aloft it projected 15 feet forward. As each row of soldiers marched 3 feet before the next, the lances of the first 5 rows projected above and beyond the phalanx. The lances of the first 3 rows had a greater reach than the 6-foot javelin of the nearest Greek hoplite. The Macedonian soldier, after hurling his lance, fought with a short sword and protected himself with a brass helmet, a coat of mail, greaves, and a lightweight shield. Behind the phalanx came a regiment of old-fashioned archers, who shot their arrows over the heads of the lancers. Then came a siege train with catapults and battering rams. Resolutely and patiently, playing Frederick William I to Alexander's Frederick, Philip drilled this army of 10,000 men into the most powerful fighting instrument that Europe had yet known. End quote. Treat this as a bit of an editorial note or something like that, whatever that equivalent would be in a podcast. But Will Durant subscribes to an old idea about the Macedonian infantry that is, I think, in many respects out of date. He mentions that the Macedonians would throw their spears, and I just want to call attention to this because it's probably incorrect by most accounts. Polybius in the 2nd century BCE mentions that the Macedonian soldiers would lower their sarissa with both hands. You've got N.G.L. Hammond from the 1900s, from the early mid-1900s, writing as a contemporary to Will Durant, saying that if the infantry had about an 18-foot-long pike, they were probably not throwing them. So I think what must be mentioned here is you get a little bit of a mixed historiography from Will Durant on what the Macedonian infantry was actually doing with their spears, with their pikes. The sarissa, the 20-foot-long pike that Will Durant references, is probably not a thrown pike, but perhaps the doru, the shorter spear that Greek hoplites might have used in opposition to the Macedonians, that may have been thrown. So you'll get some pushback. This is probably an older idea, like I said, something that has been made a bit out of date by modern scholarship. Just thought I would throw that out for you so that you wouldn't be led to believe that the Macedonians actually threw their spears. Theoretically, this military that Philip II puts together is both maneuverable, so you get to take advantage of the benefits of the phalanx, but you also get to minimize some of the things that make it difficult, like the fact that it can't move. He also adds in his companion cavalry, those 800 nobles that will ride around with the king. If you can lock in your enemy against a phalanx and sort of trap them, you can have your cavalry come in, swoop in, and sort of be the decisive blow that ends a battle. Theoretically, this is how Philip's military will fight. And the Greeks, who fight in phalanx hoplite warfare, they have shorter spears, they're heavier armored, they typically will not employ the cavalry aspect as well or as numerously as the Macedonians will, and so the Greeks are drubbed year over year by the Macedonians while Philip is campaigning up and down Greece, conquering them at will. What's interesting, though, and we will mention this here because it's a talking point about military technology and tactics. It's been a talking point for years. There's this old idea that the Macedonians were better armored, more maneuverable, all this, than the Persians that they will eventually fight. There's this old concept, and Will Durant will lean into this a touch when he writes about things. There's this old concept that the Persians have these light wicker shields and they're wearing robes and they're not really wearing armor and they're not organized. And so when they come up against Alexander's Maserati, hoplite army, combined arms hoplite army, by the way, they can't withstand it. They don't know what to do. They're not organized. They're the mob from Persia. This is not entirely an accurate representation of the fighting style that the Greeks and Persians will engage in, and often the Persians are attributed as having hundreds of thousands of men in their armies, while the Macedonians are given about 38,000, 39,000. So the numbers are always inflated for the Persians, and so it leads you into this, civilized Greek army versus a mob, a rabble, a horde. Again, this is probably not accurate, a representation for how the Persians fought. They were an incredibly cosmopolitan army. They are renowned for coming up against enemies and adapting tactics from their enemies and sort of applying it to their own army so that theoretically, whatever sort of military they will face, they have aspects in their own combined arms army that they can counter. They have counter punches. You always talk in sports. Do you have a second punch? Do you have something that you can go to if your opponent can counter your main punch? Well, the Macedonians have a really kick-ass main punch. They also have the ability to counter. The Persians do as well, theoretically. I would also point out, and this will be our little diatribe about tactics and strategy and things like that, I would point out that if you read the ancient writers, when they're writing about Alexander's escapades here against the Persians, they don't necessarily write about how his army was just fabulously better and all of these things. They don't just argue the tactics and the spears were the difference. You're not gonna run into things like that. What you're gonna run into, though, will be comments about how the enemy lost the will to fight. Phobos. There's this concept in Greek writing or later Roman writing about how there was this god, this Greek god Phobos, who would appear on the battlefield, and it was this fear, and he would infest enemy armies, and they would flee, and then when an enemy flees in ancient warfare, that's where the casualties occur. They don't necessarily occur in the press, in the main part of a battle. They occur afterward when the enemy has seen his opponent and sees that continued resistance is useless, and he flees, runs away. That's where things get nasty. And that's where these ancient writers, Arrian, etc., they will talk about the Macedonians winning because they don't succumb to Phobos. They don't succumb to fear. They have trained over years and years in combat that they've seen a few things. They kind of know what's coming. They know how to stand their ground. They know how to not lose their head. And the ancient writers, they don't write about the pikes. They don't write about the nuts and bolts tactical things here or there necessarily. They write about how the Persians succumbed to Phobos. So just bear that in mind as we are running through this discussion. We won't go too nuts and bolts on the battles themselves. We'll still maintain our focus on the logistics. But it's too cool. I couldn't help myself. And so you got a little 15-minute diatribe about Philip's army, which, by the way, one of the coolest things in ancient history. Obviously, Alexander the Great is one of the most polarizing and interesting figures in world history, if not for the way that he goes and conquers an empire that was just, in a lot of people's eyes at the time, and then even afterwards, it was an empire that, while there were cracks that Alexander is eventually able to kind of put a lens on, the Persian Empire is the first truly cosmopolitan empire. The Persians, in many ways, walked so the Romans could run. So when Alexander the Great goes and conquers the Persians, I mean, that's like beating Jordan's bulls at the height of Jordan's bulls. Maybe there's some cracks underneath the surface. Maybe perhaps Dennis Rodman's going a little crazy, but still, if you can beat Jordan's bulls, they get remembered in history, right? That if the Pistons were ever able to get over the hump and actually beat Jordan's bulls at the height of Jordan's bulls, John Stockton might be looked at a little differently if John Stockton was able to beat Jordan in Jordan's heyday. Well, that's essentially what Alexander the Great does. But what if John Stockton, and this might not make any sense, I don't even know where I'm going with this, but what if John Stockton got his superpowers from somebody else? He was he's leeching, right? Alexander the Great's a little bit of a leech. Because while he's excellent and amazing, and we're about to talk about how he was such a brilliant logistical leader, he inherits this great Maserati combined arms army. He does not fashion it in his own image. It's ready to rock and roll. It's got the keys in the ignition. All Alexander the Great has to do is hop in the driver's seat. When Philip is assassinated at this wedding celebration, whatever it is, Alexander the Great immediately, for a couple months, consolidates his grip on the Macedonian throne. He goes up into the mountains and he conquers a couple tribes there to basically cover his bases in Greece, and then he sets his sights on Persia. He decides that he's going to fulfill his father's destiny. And you get into questions about what sort of a man was Alexander, and this is where he's so fascinating because you can read into his life, and a lot of sources have, and a lot of people writing about Alexander have. I mean, there's books coming out about Alexander every year because he's an infinitely fascinating individual, because not only do you have this Maserati military that's just waiting for him that his father's fashioned, you also get a really interesting guy that then gets to take over this military. Alexander's a fascinating guy. And while he does have this great military just sort of waiting for him to coax it into superstardom, he's got to deal with some very interesting situations in his own right. He's got to get this army from Macedon all the way to Persia. And this is no small thing. He's got to supply this army. He's got to transport this army. He's got to keep the army happy. He's got to win battles when battles present themselves. But I think I'd argue, and maybe other historians would back me up on this, the battles themselves are a great achievement, but the battles to me are not the thing that sets him apart. The part that sets him apart in my mind is his ability to get there, to keep the army happy, to keep the army fed. That's what Frederick Engels, in my mind, is diving into with his book, Alexander the Great and the Logistics of the Macedonian Army. Pretty self-explanatory title, right? In the introduction, Engels writes about how Alexander was interested in logistics or maybe some downstream effects of logistics from childhood. He writes this, quote, and he's quoting Vitruvius. Alexander, delighted with this type of plan, inquired at once if there were fields in the vicinity which could supply that city with provisions of grain. When he found this could not be done except by sea transport, he said, Dinocrates, I see the unusual form of your plan, and I am pleased with it. But I perceive that if anyone leads a colony to that place, his judgment will be criticized. For just as when a child is born, if it lacks the nurse's milk, cannot be fed or led up to the courses of growing life, so a city without fields and their produce abounding within its walls cannot grow, nor become populous without an abundance of food, nor maintain its people without provisions." End quote. It must be said with sources about Alexander that it's very possible some of the quotes we have of him are apocryphal. They probably didn't happen, or maybe they didn't quite happen the way they are passed down to us, but it's what we've got in the sources when Vitruvius is writing about Alexander. And this is true a lot of times with historical figures, throughout history, is they do things and then people, Plutarch would be a great example of this, they try and pull lessons and write moralizing histories about these people after the fact, or they try and create scenes where they'll say something and you go, see, they were always this sort of special individual. When I did a show on 1066, one of the quotes that I quoted in that show was the same kind of a thing. It was a history of Harold's life, and Snorri Sturluson, I think, was the historian we quoted in that, and he gives this story about Harold Hardrada, once housecarls. He's going to be a great conqueror, and his elder brother, turns to Harold as a young boy, and he says he's going to be a great warrior, that kind of a thing. Probably doesn't happen, but it's in the sources, and so you sort of just take it at face value because it's like, well, I mean, what else do you have to go on? In his introduction, Engels talks about the purpose of this book. It has a very specific purpose, and he's going to be doing some math calculations in order to arrive at some conclusions, and he tells us how he's going to do that. The first thing he's going to look at is consumption rate. He's going to look at if Alexander's army is this big, this is how much food he would need to keep them supplied. So he's going to look at, this is what the average man would consume on a military campaign. This is what the average pack animal or horse or what have you will consume. So we're going to get a number there about the consumption rate, but then we're also going to look at their movement. So if you have a consumption rate per day and then your average, distance traveled per day, you can kind of get this formula that says, okay, if it took him 4 days to march from here to here, here's how much food he would have needed to get his army from here to here. Engels writes this, quote, "This last procedure will produce a model of the Macedonians' logistic system, adjustable for different terrain, numbers of personnel, and animals." He continues, "The second task will be to apply this model to the human and physical geography and the climatic conditions of Alexander's route as they existed in his day. Far from being a mere line drawn on a map," Engels writes, "each of the routes followed by the Macedonians is the result of a conscious decision by Alexander to best fulfill his army's strategic and logistic objectives. I hope to reconstruct Alexander's routes in eastern Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkestan with more accuracy than has been done previously, and more importantly, to discover the logistic and strategic reasons for Alexander's choice of these routes." End quote. Engels then gives us a note on the sources of Alexander's expedition and his life, which that could be a whole podcast in and of itself, but suffice to say there's a few of them, but you sort of take different things from the different sources with an understanding of what those sources are trying to do. He writes that the primary sources are Arrian, Curtius, Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and Justin. Strabo occasionally supplies valuable geographical information, but all of those sources are almost what you would consider secondary. Well, not what you can. These are secondary sources. These were written 300 plus years after the fact. Your primary sources come from two major places. They come from Ptolemy and Aristobulus. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, so theoretically you're getting a really close look at Alexander the man, because if you go back to Alexander's childhood, he grew up being tutored by Aristotle and a couple of the other students in that classroom. Ptolemy's one of them. So he grows up with Alexander, has a great relationship with Alexander, is one of his leading generals. You would think that you would get a great look at Alexander through the lens of Ptolemy. And in a lot of ways you do, but you also get this thing that happens in historical sources when, somebody's writing a history and they've been through great events. Typically, they're going to add a little bit of a slant or a vindication somehow in the source. And so in Ptolemy's writing, you do get a little bit of that kind of a thing where he has grudges against other generals. You have infighting within Alexander's cabal of generals. Ptolemy will at times take other generals to task over different things, and it's not overt. It'll be very, very subtle, but it'll be the way that he describes a battle or a siege or something like this. He'll say that such and such person was the first one through the breach if it was a thing that was bad, or such and such person really insisted that we should go do this if it was a bad thing. Ptolemy always does the really good thing, you know. It's stuff like that that you compare him to other sources and you go, oh, okay. Ptolemy might be massaging his legacy just a little bit with this one. And Aristobulus is another close-ranking member of Alexander's court, and he is mostly universally regarded as somebody writing a very, a nice interpretation of Alexander. You're not getting, with either of these sources, a very, shall we say, even-handed approach to Alexander the man. You're getting a pro-Alexander writing by both Aristobulus and Ptolemy, but Ptolemy, he's pretty fair, but he's also kind of pro-Ptolemy at the same time. The best source for Alexander's campaigns is typically regarded as Arrian. Diodorus Siculus gives you a lot about the early life of Alexander, but Arrian is really your best source for the military stuff for a couple different reasons. One, he was a soldier in the Roman army, so he would have fought in an ancient battle, and this is something that is difficult for historians now to kind of piece together, is you don't have historians writing about Alexander that understand fundamentally ancient warfare. You think that we would, right? We've got the Corinthian helmets in, museums. We've got the pikes, we've got the spears, we've got the swords. We have all the gear and the kit, but we don't actually know how the ancient battlefield worked. So sometimes the way these battles and campaigns are written about in modern historiography, you're having to kind of imagine some things or fill in some blanks, but you just don't have that intimate context that Arrian would have had, because Arrian understood ancient warfare. He'd fought in ancient battles. But also with Arrian, and he writes a pretty even-handed account, most historians would agree. But again, the thing with Arrian that is difficult to deal with, or just something you have to bake in, is he's writing a couple hundred years after the fact. And because Arrian is a Roman, as most Romans were, he was a pretty pro-Alexander kind of a guy. The Romans really liked Alexander. The Romans saw themselves in Alexander's campaigns. They always looked for, hey, who are people in history that we can sort of look to? Well, Alexander's probably your best bet. Donald Engels gets his account rolling by saying this about Alexander and Philip. And he's saying this sort of as a nod to Philip's tactical genius, logistical genius. He's also talking about how Alexander takes that and sort of parlays it into what he eventually parlays it into. Engels writes this, quote, "The army inherited by Alexander had been transformed by Philip into the most effective fighting force in Europe or Asia, and Alexander not only retained many of Philip's veterans, but also the disciplinary measures and logistic organization he imposed on the army. Philip had forbidden wagons to be used by the army, and had limited servants to one for every 10 foot soldiers, and one for every cavalryman to carry hand mills." End quote. Engels points out that this choice by Philip to limit the baggage train to have servants carry things for the army instead of wagons or anything like that, that's an unusual choice. A lot of times in ancient armies, you're going to have armies with large baggage trains, but Engels digs in deeper onto what this actually means. It means you have an ability with maneuver that you wouldn't have otherwise. He says, quote, "The fast march rates achieved by the Macedonian army, as well as the speed and tactical genius Alexander displayed in all his campaigns, is inconsistent with a large, unwieldy train of followers." End quote. You would think a horse or a cow or an ox or a donkey or something like this would make your life easier. If you're an army, you could just load them up with all of your gear, maybe stick it in the back of a wagon and just carry on your way. And that would be the most efficient way to carry all of your stuff. But Engels points out a very practical thing, something that a book like this is great for, because I would have never in a million years thought about this. But this is maybe one of the primary reasons why a baggage train is not employed by Philip and Alexander's armies. Engels writes this, quote, "Another reason for the restricted use of carts by Philip and Alexander was the inefficient throat and girth harness used for horses and mules in antiquity. The throat harness was placed directly over the animal's windpipe, and the harder he pulled, the more it choked him, so that much less weight could be pulled than with a modern, rigid shoulder harness. Carts were also liable to break down, and their movement would be impeded in rough and hilly country, since the animals would have to pull harder and hence choke more." Engels continues a couple paragraphs later by saying, "It should be remembered that manpower was as effective as horsepower in antiquity because of this same harness issue." There's also the other consideration that men eat less than horses do, so you got to feed them less, and they are basically just as capable. So, okay, let's just have all of our guys carry all their stuff. So Philip and Alexander both employ this use of, they'll have servants along with the army, but also the army just carries all their own stuff. A novel idea, something that other ancient armies in antiquity, they're not doing this nearly as much. The Romans will do this a little bit. Engels points out that a tent for, your average run-of-the-mill Roman tent costs about 40 pounds. So there'll be a guy that will carry the tent, and they will spread out the load of, what the army has to carry between groups of like 8 men. So one guy would carry the tent, one guy would carry, fill in the blank. You'll go down the line. So then the Macedonian army basically carries its own stuff. Every man to himself carries his own stuff. Engels concludes then that based on how fast the Macedonian army is able to travel, he says that at their peak, they were able to get 19 and a half miles a day, which, by the way, that's very good for an army to be able to get nearly 20 miles in a day. He says that because of this, and because there are about 48,000 men and 6,100 cavalry horses when they leave the Hellespont, he says for a total 65,000 personnel, they probably had no more than 20,000 pack animals. This is important because if they have more than that, if they've got your traditional, 100,000 plus pack animals and they march in a single file, Donald Engels says that that wagon train or that army would stretch 300 miles. Now, Alexander's object early on in this campaign is he wants to draw the Persians into a battle so that he can steal their supplies and supply his army and sort of set up a base of operations from where he can, stage an attack on the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This ends up being the Battle of the Granicus. And what's so interesting about the Battle of the Granicus is there's a Greek mercenary named Memnon of Rhodes, and he will send messages back to Darius, and they all say, pull back and just sort of let Alexander starve out. He says, don't come fight him, just leave him alone. Memnon is sort of employing one of those age-old military maxims, like, don't invade Russia in winter. Well, in antiquity, probably one of those military maxims would be, if you're the king of Persia and somebody tries to attack you, just starve him out. He has to travel so far to get to you that if you just stay outside of his reach, he won't be able to do much to you. And Memnon makes this argument over and over to Darius. From Arrian, Memnon supposedly says this, quote, "March ahead, destroying the grazing land by trampling it with the cavalry, and burn the standing harvest, not even sparing the cities themselves. Alexander would not remain in the country," he said, "if provisions were scarce." End quote. There's also this other thing to consider here with Memnon, is that there tends to be this motif of Persians not listening to sage non-Persian advice. Supposedly, in Herodotus, Xerxes ignores the advice of Artemisia of Halicarnassus, which is, of course, hilarious because Herodotus himself is from Halicarnassus, so maybe he's throwing his people a bone in a way. He's saying, a person of Halicarnassus, a person of my people, advised Xerxes not to invade the Greeks, and he didn't listen. There's a moralizing thing going on. there might be a little bit of that here with Memnon's character. It's tough to know. You sort of have to take it at face value, but it mirrors Herodotus in a way that Arrian will write this. And in the landmark version, Memnon supposedly says to all of the other satraps who don't listen to him, they say, well, you're a Greek, so we're not going to listen to you. And a classic example of a historian tipping their hand a little bit, saying, maybe you should have done this. Donald Ingalls writes this, quote, hence, Memnon's strategy of laying waste all the territory through which the Macedonians would have to pass would have been extremely effective if carried out. End quote. He continues saying that he would have deprived Alexander's foraging parties, but would have also prevented the towns from replenishing their limited preserves, from which the Macedonians would also acquire provisions. But instead, because Memnon of Rhodes is a Greek, or maybe because he doesn't actually hold enough sway to convince the other satraps to adhere to his plan, they don't listen to him, and they meet Alexander in battle at the river Granicus. And in a classic example of the hammer and anvil tactic, Alexander's troops hold up the Persians in their infantry formation with their 21-foot-long pikes, and then the cavalry dashes in to sort of win the day. There's a moment, though, when everything goes awry, when everything almost goes awry. Alexander nearly gets his head chopped off, but one of his companions takes out the Persian that nearly kills Alexander, and you get this great story of, Greek courage and moralizing, and Plutarch, of course, loves this kind of thing where he says, oh, you have these heroes that come in and save the day, and then they're blessed with, riches beyond their wildest dreams, or whatever the moral of the story is. You save your state, your king, who is, in the case of the ancient world, if your king is fighting in the battle, the head of state is leading your troops into battle, and therefore, if he falls, the state falls. So it all wraps up into this ancient ethos, this Greco-Roman ethos of you've got soldiers that save the day, therefore we should praise them. That's essentially what you have here with the Battle of the Granicus. But regardless, Alexander at the Granicus is able to prove his mettle in some senses, but also he takes out a militia force. The Persian force that meets him at the Battle of the Granicus is a hastily put together militia. Remember, the Macedonians are a professional standing army. He takes them out, probably should have easily taken them out as he does, and then he moves forward. But what's interesting about what Alexander does after the Battle of the Granicus is he has this choice. He can choose to choose your adventure kind of a thing. You could go this route, you could go that route, and the choice that you make is going to dictate the sort of logistical nightmare you may or may not have. It's all tied into where you go next. Donald Ingalls writes this about what Alexander chooses to do after the Battle of Granicus. Alexander, then, was unlikely to have traveled from Daskylion to Sardis directly, and in all probability he chose the same coastal route followed by all armies traveling north to south in the Troad. Xerxes, Xenophon, Scipio Africanus the Elder, the Arab commander Maslama, the Second Crusade led by Louis VII, and early modern Turkish armies have all traveled along the coastal route past Ilium to Andantris and Andromidium. End quote. Very sorry there for the pronunciations. Try my best, but guarantee you I butchered some stuff there. But the two options are more of an overland route and then a coastal route. That route that he's talking about that militaries would have taken time after time after time in history is this coastal route that sort of follows the coast of Asia Minor, goes down into Israel and Gaza, and then would have gone back over towards Assyria and towards Persepolis, in the heart of the Persian Empire. And that's essentially what Alexander does. He follows this coastal route, and the reason why you would do that, Ingalls points out, is because you can have a fleet of ships that can provision you, because that is much more maneuverable in the Mediterranean. You have a fleet that can provision you along the coast as you work your way down, and then you will take different cities as you go. He quotes Arrian, who says this about what Alexander does after the Battle of the Granicus. Quote, after receiving the city of Sardis in surrender and confiscating its badly needed treasury, Alexander advanced to Ephesus, covering the 60-mile distance in 4 days. The army probably took the Persian royal road connecting the two cities, which crosses the spur of Mount Tmolus at Karabel and proceeds hence down the Caister Valley. No water or supply problems would be encountered in this rich, productive region, especially now during the harvest." End quote. I can't help myself. I return back to the Wilderant, and while it must be said, he's never the most accurate historian you're going to get for everything that we talk about. He's got this way of describing things that just sort of works, and he very succinctly describes what happens after the Battle of the Granicus, because our logistical conversation really continues after the Battle of the Issus, which happens in 334 BCE. But you have this years-long period where, or I should say year-long period, where after Granicus he follows this coastal route, and then he's got to make a decision about what he's going to do in order to conquer Persia. I mean, he's got to go overland now, and how is he going to supply his army overland, which is a much more difficult proposition. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Wilderant writes about what happens after the Battle of the Granicus, quote, "After giving his men a rest, he marched down into Ionia, offering the Greek cities democratic self-government under his protectorate. Most of them opened their gates without resistance." End quote. So Alexander goes down that coastal route for a little bit, but he does realize that there is an object he must reach if this whole campaign is going to work. He's got to reach the Cilician gates by sometime in August 333 BCE. Donald Engels writes this, quote, "Whichever route Alexander chose, he would somehow have to reach the Cilician gates from the lower bend of the Halys River sometime in August, the driest time of the year in the most arid and desolate region of Anatolia. In terms of water and agricultural resources, the most feasible route for Alexander to have chosen went from Caesarea Mazaca via Mustilia to Tyana, a journey of 82 miles. A route further west would take the Macedonians near the Salt Lake, or Tuz Golu, where fresh water is unobtainable in summer since the region is virtually true desert." End quote. Now, the Persians make a giant mistake here. They just abandon the Cilician gates. And you might be wondering, what is the Cilician gates? What are these words that you're saying? Cilician gates are a pass in Turkey that you've got to go through if you're going to make it to the heart of the Persian Empire. And strategically, it's an incredibly important spot that the Persians would have needed to hold in order to make Alexander's life really difficult. But in a fantastic stroke of luck, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, they abandon this pass and Alexander marches through it. This sets up this important second conflict. Now, that first battle of the Granicus, that was between the militia. He's gotten Darius's attention. Darius, in his capital city of Susa, will now know that there's a serious issue going on. They're sending letters back and forth to one another, and all of the bravado and the myth making of Alexander, that's happening right here in this journey. Strategically and tactically, he goes through the Cilician gates and sort of makes his presence felt in and around that area. But disaster nearly strikes right here, right after this great victory of, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. You establish your foothold in this Persian Empire in a very real way, and you start capturing cities around this area. The problem is, this area is malarial, and Alexander, for 2 months, suffers a bout with what Donald Engels calls pernicious malaria. He writes, quote, "Darius, meanwhile, had been marshaling his forces at Babylon, and when he heard of the death of Memnon by the first week of September, he left Babylon on the 577-mile journey up the Euphrates to Sokoi, a march which probably took about 48 days, including the necessary halts and the 5 days it took to cross the river. When Alexander had almost recovered from his illness, he received intelligence that the Persians were within a 5 days' march of Cilicia. 5 days later, perhaps in the 4th week of October, the king had fully recovered, and he sent Parmenio with the allied infantry, the Greek mercenaries, the Thracians, and the Thessalian cavalry at almost 1/4 of the army to picket the passes leading into Cilicia and from the surrounding mountains. Parmenio also occupied the Karakapu Pass, which connects the Ardana Plain and the plain of Issus, and capture the latter town. By this time, the Persians had encamped at Sokoi, and Parmenio had to drive out the Persian pickets already occupying the Syrian gates. Darius, Engels writes, had chosen his location with care, since the Amuk plain offered unrestricted maneuverability for his larger force, and at first abundant supplies. End quote. So Darius occupies this wide plain, which is theoretically a great spot for his numerous army, if the numbers are to be believed. Will Durant will tell us that there's approximately 600,000 men in Darius's army at the Battle of the Issus. That number is probably inflated. I think most modern historians will claim that that number is probably closer to about 100,000 men, but there's no way of knowing for sure. And Donald Engels writes that Alexander embarks on his journey with about 48,000 men. That number could have been anywhere from 38 to 48,000. Regardless, Alexander's most likely outnumbered significantly in the Battle of the Issus, and what he does is really interesting. He doesn't pursue any sort of a battle. He waits. He secures his rear. He deals with some mountain tribes around his location there at the Cilician Gates and at Cilicia. And instead of pursuing any sort of decisive battle, Alexander sort of waits for Darius to make his move. There's several things happening here. There's a tactical advantage that Alexander's asserting. There's also a logistical advantage. These two things are kind of working in tandem with one another. The tactical advantage is obviously that Darius has this wide open plain for his more numerically superior force to occupy. It's a little bit easier for his army in this wider plain. And Alexander's occupying this narrow space, this pass in Turkey that obviously will compress the amount of space that Darius can occupy, and it sort of is boxing him into a corner if he goes into that pass where Alexander's waiting for him to go. But Darius is trying to, bring an end to this whole Alexander fiasco, and so he wants this thing wrapped up and done with. And Alexander's just sort of waiting, biding his time, acting very unconcerned about the whole Darius thing. And Darius has an issue in that he's in a spot logistically where food it has a expiration date on it. Donald Engels compares it to another battle, another campaign. He compares it to Robert E. Lee's campaign and the eventual battle at Gettysburg in the American Civil War. Similar to Darius, Robert E. Lee has a force of 75,000 men, which is in the ballpark of probably what Darius has at the Battle of the Issus. Robert E. Lee has an almost entirely infantry army, which is probably also what Darius has at the Battle of the Issus. But the same problem that Robert E. Lee faces and why he ultimately brings his army to battle at Gettysburg is the same issue that Darius deals with there before the Battle of the Issus. Donald Engels writes about it, quote, "In 2 days after the army had concentrated at Gettysburg, the food began to run low. This is because when any army remains stationary and is remote from river or sea transport, it will quickly exhaust the supplies of the surrounding territory, no matter how productive that territory is, and no matter how great the capability of the animal-drawn transport system. Lee understood that because of the shortage of supplies, he could not conduct a lengthy defensive operation against the Federal troops in their strong positions, and hence was forced to launch the disastrous attacks of July 2nd and 3rd. Engels continues, Darius was also remote from the Euphrates and the sea, and the logistic capabilities of his commissariat were far less than were the Confederate armies of 1863, no matter what type of wagons or draught animals he used. Alexander, however, was able to delay in Cilicia without supply problems since he had access to the sea transport facilities at the ports of Tarsus, Soli, and Megarsus. It is likely, then, that the Persians were rapidly exhausting the resources of the Amuk plain since they had remained there for at least 2 weeks. And, as Alexander well knew, Darius was compelled either to attack or to order a demoralizing and humiliating retreat. Supply was the basis of Lee's strategy as it probably was for Darius." End quote. The Battle of the Issus has a simple explanation or a simple narrative. It also has a slightly more complex narrative. The simple narrative is that Alexander's forces array in a wide line, and he crosses a river to engage Darius's forces, where his infantry and cavalry drive Darius from the field. And, Darius flees, leaves his family, leaves his camp, and the Macedonians ransack Darius's camp. But there's a few signposts or story elements that will come up often when you're reading about Alexander's campaigns. Namely, Darius receives sage advice from a Greek, and he ignores it, which is, of course, it's one of those things where it's like, did this really happen? I don't know, because it seems to happen in every major instance. Darius receives sage advice from a Greek and ignores it, or a Persian receives. You see how this thing goes. But there is a Charidemus who tells Darius to divide his forces and then allow Charidemus to fight alone against Alexander and sort of have Darius hang back. Supposedly at this battle, there's anywhere from 25 to 100,000 Persians, probably 10,000 Greeks in Darius's army. Of course, Darius ignores, as the story goes, Darius ignores Charidemus's advice, and he arrays his army in a big block, and then Alexander comes across the river and dashes the Persians. There's this implied almost turning of formations that happens in ancient battles. Often you'll have one wing pressing towards the other wing, and then you have like this circling thing that happens. So Alexander's right presses through the Persian left, and then the Persian right pushes through Alexander's left. So you almost have like, this dancing of lovers kind of a thing in the battle formation. Arrian writes about the battle like this, quote, Darius's Greeks fought to thrust the Macedonians back into the water and save the day for their left wing. In their turn, with Alexander's triumph plan before their eyes, were determined to equal his success and not forfeit the proud title of invincible hitherto universally bestowed upon them. End quote. Supposedly, Alexander locates Darius in the center and goes after him. Darius's brother Oxathres tries to stop Alexander and fails, and Darius flees in his chariot and eventually on horseback, and Alexander's wounded in the battle. Again, it's a theme. It's one of those, Alexander's a reckless general. He's throwing caution to the wind as he's charging in, and so he often gets in harm's way. And so it's almost like this apocryphal story where you don't know if it's actually true or not. Does he get injured in these battles, or are later sources like Plutarch and Arrian writing in these injuries as almost like consequences of his gravitas or of his daring? It's like lessons to be learned. Hey, maybe you shouldn't lead from the front. Maybe you shouldn't run in and just sort of try and decapitate the enemy in one fell swoop. Maybe you should be a little bit more prudential. Who knows? Either way, Alexander is wounded in the thigh, but the Persians are defeated. And then, the Battle of the Issus is claimed by the Macedonians. The Battle of the Issus is incredibly consequential, not just because the Macedonians win, but because of what it allows Alexander to do logistically afterwards. The Persian Empire is this almost enormous confederation stitched together by the King of Kings. It's a king above other kings. It is not this, supremely consolidated empire that is, consolidated into this one authoritarian figure, which it is, but you have satraps and you have other kings that pledge fealty to the Persian king. So when the Persian king is defeated, there's this massive power vacuum, and you've got these city-states, and you have these individual cities, and you have these smaller little empires that almost are kind of left out in the cold because you don't have that Persian influence being enforced upon them anymore because the Persian king just ran away. His family just got captured by Alexander. His tent was ransacked, all of these things. Well, you're going to see Alexander solve his logistical problems because we're not really on the coastal route anymore. If we're going to go take the Persian Empire and do this thing for real, we've got to go overland. So what Alexander will do now that he's defeated Darius for real is he's going to demand fealty from different cities along his route, and they're going to surrender to him. And as part of their surrender, they're going to furnish his army with supply. So he's going to secure an advanced supply route before his army goes through these different places. Donald Engels also writes that Alexander will secure 7,000 Persian pack animals after the Battle of the Issus at Damascus. Many of those are camels. So if you'll recall, we talked about horses and men. In the ancient world, the man is just as effective as a horse because the man consumes a third of the grain that a horse would consume. But of course, he can only carry about a third of the weight. So you have this cost and effect of, well, I don't have to feed them as much, but they can last a little bit longer than a horse can. Well, a camel requires much less grain than a horse, but can carry more than a man. So Alexander begins this campaign of securing different cities along his route. The first major one he will besiege is Tyre. The Macedonians will besiege Tyre from January to July before they're eventually victorious. And Donald Engels writes that they will inhabit this plain. And from January to July, the Macedonian combatants, followers, and cavalry horses would need 28,172 tons of grain for that 7-month siege. Engels points out that there's a problem here. Quote, "The coastal plain of Tyre, however, is only 13 square miles, and hence its gross annual grain production will only be about 2,080 tons. The city of Tyre itself imported much of its food from Palestine. The logistic situation of the army could be exacerbated because the harvests in this region do not begin until June. Remember, they start besieging the city in January." Engels continues, "And hence the army would have to requisition grain from the granaries in nearby towns, which would be depleted in the months just before harvest. In this context, the letter Alexander wrote to the high priest at Jerusalem demanding provisions and an alliance while he was besieging Tyre is certainly authentic." He continues, "Arrian also stated that Palestine made an alliance with the Macedonians during the siege of Tyre. The raid into the anti-Lebanon region led by Alexander himself to secure supplies of timber may also have had for its objective the opening up of supply lines to that fertile region." End quote. The march of Alexander's Macedonians after the siege of Tyre, Donald Engels writes, is probably the most difficult logistical challenge he will face until the Gudrosi Desert. The reason for this is because there's no water. So if you're marching through Palestine into Gaza, which he does after the siege of Tyre, he sieges Gaza. Where are you going to get water from? He writes that there are 35 water sources along that route, but those water sources are so minuscule they won't supply the army's required 100,000 gallons of water per day. Where do you get the water from? Donald Engels posits that they probably had the fleet that was coasting along the Palestinian shore. They probably got their water from a fleet or they brought it overland. But either way, this logistical problem it's a difficult one. How are you going to feed, an army of, let's say, 40,000 men, and then you've got your other camp followers? You probably have a total force, if you're adding everything up, it's probably somewhere between 55 and 60,000 individuals that you've got to feed. Engels writes this, quote, "Earlier and later armies alike have experienced great difficulties in crossing the Sinai Peninsula and have required massive preparations before their advance. For the invasion of Egypt by Cambyses in 525, Engels writes, the establishment of advanced depots of water and, apparently, the use of a primitive pipeline were required. Artaxerxes lost part of his army in the quicksand crossing the Sabket el Bardouil because of a failure to obtain advance intelligence during his invasion of Egypt in 350. Later, in 306, Antigonus carried part of his army's supplies by a fleet, which was partially wrecked in a storm while crossing the coast of the peninsula at about the same time of year as did Alexander. The difficulties Bonaparte experienced in his crossing are well known. Immense and difficult must have been the preparations before the Macedonian army crossed in late September or October. Yet, as usual, not a single word of these preparations appears in our sources." End quote. Now, you got to keep in mind that we are about 3.5 years into Alexander's expedition by now. These battles do not happen one right on top of the other one. They're spread out a little bit. You got to think that Darius has enough time to raise multiple armies to face Alexander. He's got the army that he raises for the Battle of the Issus, and then he's got this other army that he'll raise that he will fight Alexander with at the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander has two options logistically, and I guess the route he could choose to face Darius. Now, he could go down the Euphrates River, which is what Darius expects he will do, or he could do what he ends up doing, which is he could march eastward along an old military highway along the hilly flanks of the Taurus and Zagros mountains. This is not what Darius expects he will do because he imagines, Darius does, that Alexander will just follow the Euphrates because he will have an easy access to water for his army to feed from. But instead, he doesn't do that. He carries water with him and he goes along this military highway that is a forced march where the object that Alexander is trying to reach is a ford in the Tigris River. He marches so quickly, in fact, that Darius is not in position to stop his advance across the Tigris. He knows he's probably going to go to the Tigris, but he gets there before he can do anything about it. The reason why this is so important is because armies historically are incredibly vulnerable when crossing a river. You can catch one half of the army on one side of the river and take them out. You could catch the other half on the other side of the river. It's a flipped over army. Their bellies exposed. You can take advantage of them at river crossings. But because Alexander gets there so quickly, Darius can't take advantage of his opportunity. According to Strabo, this route that Alexander will take is about a 276-mile march, and Donald Engels writes that Alexander would not have had much difficulty supplying his army along this route. He writes this, quote, "The region through which it passed was and is highly fertile and productive, thickly settled with agricultural villages and towns, and the highway crosses the upper Balik and the lower Khabur rivers with their tributaries. Hence, neither water nor grain supplies would present a problem." End quote. The Battle of Gaugamela is going to follow a similar pattern as the Battle of the Issus, except this time Darius thinks that he's brought his ace in the hole. He's brought chariots. He's got 50 of them, perhaps even 100 of them, arrayed across his front line, and he's leveled the plain at Gaugamela so that his chariots can do their nasty work. The problem is the Macedonians are equipped to deal with chariots. They probably haven't dealt with chariots in the past, but the agrarian javelineers and these other elements of Alexander's combined arms army supposedly are able to turn the tide, and the chariots end up not being all that much of an issue to deal with. And the main part of the battle, again, is this Alexander and his companion cavalry charge through the Persian left, and then the Macedonian left suffers. Parmenio is in charge of the left again, as he was at the Battle of the Issus. The Macedonian left suffers and is the reason why they can't fully chase the Persians all the way off the field. They have to wheel back and support Parmenio's, force on the left, but he breaks the Persian left with his right, and then he circles back around to help his own left, which is breaking there with Parmenio. Darius again flees the field and is eventually assassinated by Bessus in 330 BCE. The supply problems that Alexander dealt with getting to this point are not much of an issue anymore because after the Battle of Gaugamela, the Achaemenid Persian Empire is on its knees. Alexander, for all intents and purposes, is now the king of kings. Darius is off the table, and all of these, we mentioned the Persian Empire, it's this confederation almost, united under a single authoritarian king. Well, all of these small cities now that Alexander has defeated the Achaemenid Persian royal army multiple times, all of these cities roll out and, prostrate themselves in front of Alexander. And he's not going to have any logistical issues until several years later he decides, hey, we should go invade India. Imagine for a moment that you're far away from any place that you've ever gone before. Everything around you is foreign. It's alien. And that would be a very similar experience to what Alexander would have experienced near the Gadrobi Desert in India, in Southeast Asia, frankly. That's where they get to here. And I have to remind myself that Alexander is from Greece, Europe, and he finds himself in antiquity nearly into Southeast Asia. I mean, this is a place that doesn't get penetrated by the West, frankly, until Marco Polo enters Kublai Khan's court, hundreds of years later. It's just it's this blending of East and West, and, we could wax poetic about how Alexander sort of changes world history in many different ways, if for no other reason than he sort of pierces this artificial divide between East and West. But imagine you're Alexander, and you're sitting in your tent, and you're in this arid climate that you've never really experienced before, and you've been on the road for nearly 9 years, and it's just everything is so very different and alien, and you're not used to it. This is the climate. This is from a more contemporary account. This is a more modern account, somebody who's retraced Alexander's journey, but they write about this weather that Alexander would have experienced here at the end of his travels, at the end of all things. Quote, "The sand burned through one's boots, and a breath of wind from the burning hot drift sand hills struck the face like flames from a fire. Gun barrels and all metallic objects were heated to such a degree that they could not be touched, and even the water of the Amu Darya was heated in July and August to 28 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The fine dust particles are everywhere, and in connection with the heat and the drought, it occasions a terrible thirst, which is not easily satisfied." End quote. It sounds a bit like something out of a Frank Herbert novel, doesn't it? It is utterly foreign. It is, oppressive. But this is the place where Alexander finds himself in sort of this Indo-Gangetic divide region in India, the way that Engels would put it. This is as far as his army will go. They are provisioned. They could keep going. This is the thing. Alexander has, logistically put all the pieces into place to where his army could continue if they need to, but the army sort of puts their foot down. They've been gone from home for a decade. They've all married, foreign wives. They've left their wives at home. They might be given up for dead. Who knows? They're Tom Hanks and Castaway at this point, and the army says, "Nope, we're turning around." And so then Alexander has to consider the question, what do you do to get back to the center of your empire? Do you go back to Greece, or do you stay in Persian territory? There's some ancient sources that would say that Alexander had no intention of ever returning to Macedon, that the generals around him were concerned that he was no longer even Macedonian, that he had forsaken all of the things that he'd grown up being, that he'd forsaken all of those things. He was no longer Philip's son. He was somehow a son of Persia. Regardless, Alexander now has this decision made. He's going to go back to the capital of this new empire that he's conquered, and he puts together the logistical operations for doing so. He collects 4 months' provisions, which Engels writes would weigh in the vicinity of 52,600 tons, and he organizes this combined land and naval expedition. He's going to follow a coastal route where the Navy will be able to supply the army from the sea with food. The army will have water because of monsoons, so the monsoon season will give them water, but the Navy will carry grain for the army. Engels writes, quote, "The coastal route Alexander planned to follow was probably the caravan route taken by Sir Aurel Stein from Karachi to Armara and followed by the Indo-European telegraph line." End quote. So Alexander processes through and captures a couple towns, or I should say he offers terms to a couple towns that is chieftains of those towns accept those terms. They surrender, sort of out of hand, as a matter of course. But the most catastrophic event in Alexander's reign happens right now. That fleet that was supposed to provision his army as he takes this coastal route back to the capital of his new empire, that monsoon prevented the fleet from sailing. Engels puts it this way, quote, "The southwest monsoon had just begun about the time Alexander began his march in mid-July, and neither he nor Nearchus knew that the adverse winds would last until late October." He continues, "This was one of the greatest crises of his life. All Alexander's elaborate preparations were shattered, and he knew that whatever decision he made would cost the lives of 3/4 of his forces. It is a tribute to his spirit of determination that Alexander kept his head and escaped the desert with so much of his army. What were his options at this critical moment, Engels wonders? There were 3. First, he could remain where he was and wait for the fleet to arrive. However, it was not possible for his entire army to remain stationary in an area that had been devastated, and that in any case he had only sufficient agricultural resources to support a few scattered towns. He continues later, option 2 was, quote, he could have marched back to Padala, but it was 290 miles from Bela to Bakhmanabad over territory that had been thoroughly devastated by the army. Few, if any, supplies would remain in territory that was mainly desert and that had suffered the passage of an army containing 87,000 infantry, 18,000 cavalry, and as many as 52,000 followers. A march of 150 miles through the fearsome Kolwa Depression was sufficient to cause the destruction of 3/4 of the entire land army. A 290-mile march to Padala would have been fatal to the entire force. He continues, now quoting Curtius. Curtius puts it this way, quote, they could neither remain where they were nor advance without danger of death. If they remained, famine, and if they went on, a deadlier enemy, pestilence, afflicted them. End quote. Let's take a beat here for a second. If you're Alexander the Great, what do? You're stuck, essentially marooned, with 100,000+ people that you have to figure out a way to feed. And you can't press on further because there's pestilence. You can't go back because, the army has already devastated the place that they've been through. So there's really nothing you can do. What Alexander opts to do is to leave a section of his force there and then pursue an inland route where they could find a habitable place that they could then resupply. Engels writes that the place they chose to go through was this Kolwa track. The problem with the Kolwa track is that you're going to suffer immensely going through this track. There's not enough food. It's hot. It's sandy. It's brutal. You're going to have a certain number of your soldiers die. Your people are going to die. It's just a matter of how many of them are going to die. And can you get enough of them through the desert, out of this pass, into a habitable land where you can resupply? Can you get enough of them through before, disaster strikes in order to not have this be a total and complete disaster? Engels writes this, quote, up till now, supplies may have been barely adequate to support the army, but in the 150-mile distance from Jau to Turbat, past the Nundara River and down the Kolwa Depression, they would not find adequate supplies of grain, water, or fodder. This, combined with the heat, burning sand, and improper diet, caused the massive destruction of human life recorded by all of our sources. After losing the track in an ocean of drifting sand, the army at last reached the vicinity of Turbat, the halting place from where the sea is nearest, and the most extensively cultivated and populous region of the Makran. Here, the remnants of the army amassed supplies of grain, dates, and sheep for the journey to Pasni. From this point on the coast, Alexander marched along the shore to the vicinity of Guatar, a distance of some 136 miles, which the army covered in 7 days. End quote. I'll admit Engels doesn't give this moment the drama that it deserves. He's not trying to. That's not the point of this book. The point is to look at how he manages to do something that is, by all accounts, incredibly difficult. Alexander loses 3/4 of his force in this march. They're marching through this sand-covered track They don't have enough supplies. They don't have enough water. 3/4 of his army will die. Of those, what was it? What did we say? 82,000, 87,000 infantry, plus followers, plus livestock. He will make it out with 1/4 that, and he will live to fight another day. It does make me wonder, though, because the Gadrobi Desert is obviously the most difficult thing that Alexander will deal with logistically throughout this entire thing. But it calls back to mind the story of Memnon of Rhodes, and this perhaps apocryphal story that there's always these sage Greeks giving fantastic advice that the Persians choose not to listen to, right? Does it actually happen? Who knows? But it's in the sources, so you just sort of take it at face value and then figure out how it fits in the grander narrative. But you've got this Memnon of Rhodes character who's telling everybody around him before the Battle of the Granicus, he's saying, hey, we should just lay waste to the country around us, even abandon cities. It doesn't matter. He seems to almost be a prophet who can see the future. He says, if we lose a city, it won't matter. We won't lose the empire. It's one of those military maxims that says, hey, maybe don't get bogged down in an advance. Don't invade Russia in winter. Maybe for antiquity, the correlating maxim would be something along the lines of, if you are the king of kings and somebody decides to invade you from the west, make them come at you. Perhaps it's a little bit ironic then that the best example of this strategy being put into use is by a Russian czar who deals with Napoleon. Famously, that instance where the maxim becomes true that you shouldn't invade Russia in winter, the Russian czar who presides over that Napoleonic collapse, well, ironically enough, what do you think his name is? It's Alexander. I wanted to put out a quick note here at the end for any of you that might be concerned that my posting this show means that I'm not working on The Sound of Distant Guns 3. I just wanted to assuage any fears. I am indeed working on Distant Guns 3, and I hope to have that out for you as soon as soon as that thing comes together. There's no telling when it'll be. I always want to make promises. I always want to say, here's when you can expect something from me. And then anytime I say, here's when it's going to happen, I get to that point and I'm like, that point in my head, whatever that point is, I get to that point and I go, yeah, it's not going to happen. So I just don't make promises anymore, but I am working on it. It will come out. This was a little bit of a breather for me. I have been so deep in Civil War stuff the past 6+ months that I was like, I need a change of pace. I need to talk about something else. I've been reading so many primary accounts. I just want to read something a little bit different. And so that's where this show came from. If you liked this little change of pace, it's a little bit shorter. It's a little bit different in terms of scope and things like this. If this was a fun little change of pace for you, let me know. You can shoot me an email at joshreadsbooks@gmail.com. The Josh in there has 2 H's, so it's JOSHH readsbooks@gmail.com. Shoot me an email if you enjoyed this, or alternately, if you hated it, shoot me an email there so I can know how this one landed. Hopefully you enjoyed it, though. As always, if you want to support what I'm doing here, you can support me on Substack. There's a link down there in the description for that. And while you're here, if you're still here, thank you so much, by the way. If you're still here, rate and review the show wherever you happen to be listening to it. Whatever the podcast algorithms are, I don't understand them, but whatever they are, they tell me it helps. So give that a shot. As always, thank you so much, and I'll see you again very soon.